Okay, so this is one of the craziest stories I've ever heard. Let me play you a clip.
Long story short, it feels like I got hit with a flashbang, and I wake up and I'm 800 miles east of there, and 2 years later. So that's basically, there ain't no other way to put it.
Now, this sounds like an old science fiction movie, right? But it's not. This is a snippet of an interview that Mike Markham did with Art Bell, the former host of Coast to Coast AM, back in 1998, and later on the show, Midnight in the Desert in 2015. To give you the whole story, though, we have to start at the beginning. Let me take you back to 1995. On the edge of a small town, in a small house in Stanberry, Missouri, lived a guy named Michael Markham. Now, Mike was only 21 years old, and he lived alone in that little house. So I'm sure you can imagine what the house looked like. But apart from empty pizza boxes and dirty clothing all through the house, there was something else. You see, Mike was no ordinary guy. He was a tinkerer. So what started at the back porch had now overtaken the house. Most every horizontal surface in the house was stacked with old radios, TVs, CD players, and so forth. In short, Mike's house harbored about every electronics device available in 1995. Now, these weren't working machines. Every single one of them was screwed open and had their guts hanging out. Diodes, transistors, and spools of copper wire lay dead on the floor. Now, to anyone else, this house is a war zone. But not to Mike. Like I said, Mike is different. Where we see a hoarder, he sees absolutely nothing wrong with it. And remember, this was pre-Amazon, so if he needed a part, he'd have to drive 64 miles to the nearest Radio Shack. Despite his deep understanding of electronics, Mike had no formal science training, so like most young guys in town, Mike worked at the local lumber mill. Mostly his head was in the clouds, though, trying to solve the riddles of the universe. But Mike was no dreamer, he was a doer. Whatever he conjured up on his day shift, he would take home and put it to practice. On the table stood his most recent project, a Jacob's ladder. Now, I didn't know what a Jacob's ladder was, but it turns out I've seen it a bunch of times, and probably so have you. It's a device that shows an electrical climbing arc between two vertical metal rods. Kind of looks like a tiny bolt of lightning. It's a classic mad scientist apparatus, stuff they used in those old monster movies. Mike's goal was simple: make a cool electrical display just because he could, and maybe to impress his buddies. Mike had no idea that that seemingly uneventful day in the fall of 1995 would completely change his life. Now, I Googled a Jacob's ladder, and the science behind it is pretty simple. The pickle is you need some serious voltage. A Jacob's ladder needs about 20,000 volts at a few milliamps, kind of similar to a cattle prod. It won't kill you, but it will definitely sting. A regular outlet is only 120 volts, so not even close to what Mike needed. With no transformer at hand, he solved this problem like he solved everything the hard way. He built his own voltage booster from scratch. He grabbed some copper wire he had laying around, and he wound it about 400 times around the metal core. Now, if his calculations were correct, his homemade transformer could step up the voltage from the outlets to a whopping 20,000 volts. For the metal rods in which the mini bolt of lightning would jump back and forth, Mike used metal coat hangers. He mounted them vertical, like rabbit ears. Now, this wasn't exactly high-tech, but Mike used what he had. The big idea behind this project was solving a problem with Jacob's ladders. They're finicky. You have to ignite the arc by hand, which most of the time resulted in a zap. And then, if the air pressure changes, or it gets too humid, it stopped working altogether, and you'd have to start all over again. So Mike thought, what if I could heat up the air between the rods? This potentially would prime the air to conduct the electricity, and the arc would start all on its own. So he pulled the laser out of an old CD player and mounted it on the table. Then he connected his homemade voltage booster and aimed the laser at the gap between the vertical rods. Then comes the moment of truth. It's hillbilly science, but if he was right, the arc would appear and start jumping back and forth between the rods, working its way up. He flipped the switch. Then, nothing. No spark, no climbing arc, just a steady hum of his transformer while an invisible laser cuts through the empty air. Frustrated, Mike watched the device for a few seconds. He was about to shut everything down when he noticed something. Floating just above the metal rods, barely noticeable, was a patch of wavy air. Mike later said it looked like a desert mirage, but round and just hanging in one spot. The effect was so faint, you'd miss it if you weren't looking carefully. Now, you and I would turn off the device and yell, "Demon, be gone, 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 gone." But now Mike, he stared at the shimmer for a moment and did something that would alter the course of his life, something that, to this day, defines Mike Markham. He glanced across his workbench, grabbed a small screw, and flicked it toward the shimmer. For an instant, the screw just disappeared. Mike blinked, looked around, and stared back at the shimmer, bewildered. Was his mind playing tricks, or was the screw, just for a moment, completely gone? There was no flash of light, no sound, no drama. It simply wasn't there anymore. In a later interview, Mike explained that the screw vanished for roughly half a second before showing up exactly where it should have landed. Mike aimed at the mirage again and threw another one. Same thing happened. And another and another. Every single time the same result. The object would disappear for about half a second and then come back, fall on the table right where you'd expect it to fall. This was a head scratcher. At first he thought it's some kind of cloaking device, that it somehow fractured light, making the screw seem invisible. But he quickly rejected that idea. If stuff was just becoming invisible, there wouldn't be a delay before it hit the table. No, something much more interesting was happening, something he needed to figure out. But first things first, a scientist needs to have proof of concept. He reached for his camera, turned it on, and just as he was about to hit the red button, disaster struck. The laser he'd salvaged from the old CD player burst into flames. In an instant, Mike watched the greatest scientific mystery he had ever witnessed go up in smoke. As the shock wore off and he'd contemplated every possible explanation, Mike had reached a conclusion. The problem was that conclusion was so crazy, it was so out there, yet it was the only possible explanation. To prove this theory in a way that would convince any future doubters, and there would be many, Mike needed to go bigger. And for that, he needed some serious stuff, not anything he could find in his electronics graveyard back at the house. No, this was his opus, and he needed to act now. The biggest obstacles were the transformers. He needed ones that could handle at least 50,000 volts, but ideally a lot more. So he called around to places that sell transformers. He was quoted about $20,000 each. For Mike, working at the mill, living paycheck to paycheck, that might as well have been $1 million. This part really shows the tenacity of this guy, though. You and I would think, okay, out of my league, let's call it a day. But not Mike. He won't take no for an answer. Not when he's about to make the biggest scientific discovery since Einstein. He needed transformers and knew exactly where to find them for free. About 10 miles away in King City, there was a utility station where 6 massive transformers sat abandoned outside the fence. According to Mike, they look like they've been retired from service and were left to rot. I bet to many people it did look like junk, but not to Mike. Mike saw a pile of gold. So he approached a friend with a pickup truck. He offered him and another buddy $100 to drive there and help him load the transformers. Now, These are not light. They're about 350 pounds each. With grit and determination, the three guys loaded 2 of them in the truck. But if you think Mike stopped there, you'd be mistaken. When speaking to Art Bell, he explained it like this. About 6 of them were sitting in front of the transfer station. At first, he said, I planned to take just a couple, but when I got there, I thought, and you know what? I might as well take them all. I mean, if I got caught, the punishment would be the same either way. Yeah, I guess I got greedy. So, in broad daylight, they drive back to Mike's house in this little truck with 6 big, heavy transformers stacked in the back. For the next month, Mike spent every waking moment working on his machine. There was a little problem, though. The transformers they stole were built to reduce voltage. They stepped down the high voltage coming from the power lines. That was exactly the opposite of what Mike needed, so Mike, being Mike, just wired them backwards. Now, instead of bringing down the voltage, if you plugged it in, it gave 20,000 volts. The big day had finally come. With a look on his face like a father meeting his firstborn for the first time after a long delivery, Mike took a normal 110 plug and pushed it into the receptacle. But now, totally opposite to his test where there was only a slight hum, now there was a huge bang and a bright light. Then all the lights dimmed and it was pitch black. Mike rushed to the window and looked outside. There he saw neighbors with candles and flashlights. Mike's machine had knocked out the power to the entire grid. Now, brownouts weren't common in Stanberry, but it wasn't the first time either. Mike quickly unplugged the transformers and threw blankets over his machine and figured it would just blow over. But he figured wrong. Some days went by and nothing happened, so Mike pulled the blankets off the machine and started tinkering again. Days later, convinced he'd fixed the problem, he once more plugged in the machine, and this time it purred like a kitten. It did, as expected. Instead of a small shimmer, though, like in his first test, Mike now had a big energy vortex hovering above his machine. As he threw objects into the shimmer, they didn't just disappear for half a second, they vanished completely. And you wouldn't think it possible, but things got even weirder. One day, Mike decided to throw a little party. A bunch of people came over, they fired up the grill, played music, and shot at bottles with a BB gun. As the night progressed, some people went inside to hang out in the living room. Then, a loud scream came from inside the house. Mike rushed inside to find his friend standing there, shaking.
Dude, your whole couch is gone.
Mike checked the machine, but it was off. He stared at the void that once held the couch. He confronted another guest.
I shit you not, man. The couch was just sitting there, and then, poof, it's gone.
Now, they all thought it was a prank, but to this day, they all stick to their story, and no one can really explain how a couch just vanished from a room full of people. Years later, when Art Bell confronted Mike about this couch story, it showed just how strange things had become. Art, somewhat skeptical, wondered how furniture could just up and vanish. I mean, the device wasn't even on. Mike admitted he had no logical explanation. He had an illogical one, though. The device seemed to be affecting reality even when completely shut off. The next day, as Mike sat in a chair next to the void where the couch used to be, aggressive knocks came from his front door. Mike opened the door and met 8 deputies filling his porch. They had a search warrant. Apparently, while shooting at bottles at the party, a pellet went through the neighbor's window. Now, it's kind of strange for a judge to order a search warrant for a pellet gun. But they had their reasons. In town, Mike had a reputation, surprise, surprise, of being a mad scientist. So when they got a report about stolen transformers and shortly after that the mysterious brownout, they simply put 2 and 2 together. The pellet gun gave them a perfect reason to enter the house and snoop around. They didn't have to search long, though. It soon as they entered, they tripped over the transformer sitting there in the middle of the living room. They arrested Mike on January 29, 1996, and charged him with felony theft. Could have been worse, though. The whole town could have sued him for browning out the grid. Mike pled guilty and got 60 days in jail and 5 years probation. Now, 60 days gave Mike plenty of time to ponder. The time was spent thinking about his experiments and trying to make sense of what happened. During those long days and nights locked up, Mike began forming new theories about what his machine was actually doing. Mike thought he might get better results using magnetic fields instead of laser energy. The theory was that the spinning plasma was causing the time effect. If he could make a powerful magnetic field to control the vortex, he wouldn't have to rely on laser to heat the air. From where he sat in jail, the theory made a lot of sense. But when Mike got out, reality set in. He lost his house, his job, but worst of all, his reputation. In a town of barely 1,000 people, Mike, Madman Markham, a nickname given by Arbel, had become an outcast. But Mike was a practical man, so instead of fighting the crowd, he moved a few towns over to St. Joseph. There he found another house and a real job and figured his time machine days were far behind him. But then, once again, everything changed. Arbel was, without a doubt, the undisputed king of late-night radio. His show, Coast to Coast AM, reached millions of listeners across North America. His audience were on the fringe, truckers, insomniacs, and ham radio operators that dared to dream beyond meat and potatoes. Apart from the news, Art covered UFOs, paranormal, and weird science. Needless to say, he was always looking for a weird story. He had heard about this young man up in Missouri who'd been arrested for trying to build a time machine, so immediately his spidey senses tingled. If there was anyone that could make someone comfortable with uncomfortable things, it was Arbel. The man was a genius. Art, however crazy the story was, never showed any disrespect or ridicule towards the guest. The interview that followed with Mike Markham became radio gold. Arbel understood transformers, voltage, and electromagnetic theory. If Mike was somehow pulling a hoax, he wasn't going to fool Art. Now, the whole story would have been easier to dismiss if Mike was wearing a tinfoil hat. If maybe he had a few stints in the psych unit, but as you heard at the opening of our story, Mike sounded real, humble, knowledgeable, and absolutely not looking for fame. Art asked Mike, given the chance and the funding, of course, if he would build a bigger version. Mike said he would. In fact, it would be a dream come true. Within hours after the interview, offers started pouring in. Listeners called and emailed pledging donations, equipment, and expertise. That phone call on Coast to Coast had changed everything for Mike Markham. He was ready for the big leagues, and if you thought he was crazy before, really, Mike was just warming up. With his new supporters, Mike came up with an ambitious plan. One guy provided access to a warehouse in Overland Park in Kansas. The owner was fascinated by the project and offered Mike the space. In exchange, all he had to do was pay the electric bill. It took him 1.5 years, but he did it. Mike built his masterpiece. There it stood, 35 feet above the floor. It was a monster. The contraption was 17 feet wide and 15 feet high. In the center, it had 2 concentric metal cylinders surrounded by electromagnetic rings. When all was said and done, the whole system needed 3 million volts. Now, to put this in perspective, Mike's original prototype, the one with the stolen transformers, used 20,000 volts. This machine needed 3 million volts. The power he was using in the warehouse was 150 times more than he used when he browned out the village back home. When Mike turned it on, it wasn't just a little shimmer. Mike called it a plasma tornado, a vertical column of superheated electrified gas spinning at incredible speeds controlled by magnetic fields. In the past, with his earlier versions, Mike caught a lot of disbelief and ridicule, of course. But this time would be different. Mike now had witnesses. About 30 people had given money or equipment towards the project, and these weren't gullible believers. Mike again started with small stuff like nuts, bolts, pieces of wood, and baseballs. He'd throw them into the vortex and they'd disappear. But this time, they weren't gone for a few seconds. They were gone for minutes. And when they reappeared, it wasn't next to the machine. What went through the shimmer reappeared between 50 and 150 feet east or west of the machine. East or west, never north or south. This, of course, was inexplicable for a normal guy. But Mike had an answer. He thought it was related to the magnetic field that surrounded the Earth. And it kind of makes sense. Mike had documented the process and found the pattern to be consistent and measurable. The higher the voltage and the faster he rotated the magnetic fields, the further stuff traveled and the longer it was gone. Slowly but surely, Mike was beginning to understand that he could control time and distance by adjusting settings. So after a bunch of experiments with balls and pieces of wood, Mike did what one does while working on a time machine. He progressed to living things like hamsters and guinea pigs. As he tossed them through the shimmer, they disappeared for 1 or 2 minutes and then reappeared east or west of the machine, just as expected. Volunteers formed lines on the east and west axis of the warehouse. They wanted to catch the animals as they appeared because, unlike a baseball, the creatures would take off. Between objects and living creatures, Mike conducted over 200 experiments. Hamsters, guinea pigs, mice, they'd vanish into the vortex and reappeared minutes later, completely unharmed and perfectly healthy. Obviously, they couldn't speak and tell Mike what happened, but physically they appeared to be completely normal. Mike had a trunk full of footage and detailed notes of each experiment. He was building a complete database of how this machine worked. Now, after more than 200 trips through the time machine, there's really only one experiment left to do. And Mike was up for the challenge. The hydraulics squealed as Mike stood on the platform of a cherry picker. He rose 35 feet above the warehouse floor, looking down at the shimmer. The machine was humming. 3 million volts of electricity fed the beast. Its plasma tornado lay wide open, ready to consume everything in its path. Mike's machine defied all logic. Modern physics did not apply. The witnesses were eager. They had made a circle around the machine at the ready to document this insanity. In the final moments before the ultimate test, Mike had maxed out all power settings. Additional generators were running at full speed to supplement the voltage. He wanted to make sure that he'd actually go through the shimmer, rather than simply falling to a certain death on a concrete floor. Now, if you don't count the couch, nothing as big or heavy had ever gone through the vortex. But from his calculations, maximum power should transport him far enough to avoid appearing mid-air above the warehouse. Mike crawled to the edge of the cherry picker. He took a deep breath. He waited too long. He knew he might chicken out. He closed his eyes and counted to 3. Then he leaped to an unknown fate. Next, Mike found himself standing in tall grass under an open sky. His head was pounding, his nervous system felt scrambled, and for a couple of terrifying minutes, he couldn't remember his own name. Slowly, very gradually, he regained small parts of his memory. As Mike found his footing, he started walking until he reached the road. He followed the road until he hit a town. The town he stumbled on was Fairfield in Ohio, 800 miles due east of his machine in Overland Park, Kansas. With no ID, no money, and a failing memory, Mike wandered until he found a homeless shelter. The volunteers saw a disheveled and confused young man and offered help. They found him a bed, and after a shower, he lined up for a hot meal. In the communal living room, he grabbed a newspaper and sat down. That's when Mike Markham nearly collapsed. Mike jumped through the vortex on August 28, 1998. The date on the paper read September 15th, 2000. He wasn't just 800 miles east of the warehouse. He'd somehow traveled 2 years ahead in time. From where Mike was standing, from the jump to the field, only lasted a few seconds. Now, more than 2 years had gone by, and for the life of him, he couldn't remember what happened that got him there. He hadn't aged, his fingernails were the same length, and he didn't have a long beard. For Mike Markham, those 2 years simply didn't exist. But for everybody else, his family, his friends, and the witnesses at the warehouse, Mike had simply vanished. Now, Art Bell had kept tabs on Mike. He'd gone on air multiple times asking if anyone had heard from Mike Markham. Then the news reported the story of a guy who vanished while doing a time travel experiment. Art was notified by his producer. They didn't mention any names, but he had a hunch on who this guy might be. But there were no leads, no clues, no trace of what had happened to Mike Markham. As far as Art and the rest of the world knew, Mike had just up and vanished. Meanwhile, back in Fairfield in the 2000s, Mike was still stuck at the homeless shelter. Snippets of his ordeal back at the warehouse came back to him like a bad dream, but obviously he couldn't tell anybody what really happened, so he played along best he could. As a precaution, Mike had emptied his pockets before the jump. He didn't want to risk anything interfering with the machine. The pickle was now he had no form of ID, but he remembered his social security number. Armed with that, and the help of the people from the shelter, DMV issued him a new license. That was step one. Mike was a person again. As time went by, more of his memory recovered. He could remember what happened and how he got there. Mike took odd jobs and saved enough money for a bus ticket back to the warehouse in Overland Park. Upon his arrival, he discovered something almost as shocking as losing 2 years. Everything was gone. The machine that had cost millions, all his documentation and notes, hours of video footage, and every single piece of evidence that his time machine ever existed was gone. His first reaction was to contact the people that had helped him. But the electromagnetics that had scrambled his brain had also erased the names and faces of the only people who could help him find his stuff or verify that it happened at all. Even if he could get his memory back without his equipment, it would be impossible to make another time machine. As disappointing as that was, Mike, Madman Markham, was, against all odds, alive and kicking. He had jumped through time and space and lived to tell about it. It took Art Bell almost 18 years to track him down again. When he finally sat down for another interview in 2015, Art said, "Man, am I glad to see you. I really thought you'd fried yourself." Mike, of course, was very much alive, but the experience had changed him. The young man who once jumped through a contraption powered by 3 million volts was now wiser, more careful. But he assured Art he hadn't given up. Mike told Art that he had plans to rebuild his machine and test it again. Art asked if he would jump again. Mike wasn't sure if he would jump again. The damage to his brain was pretty bad, but almost immediately he walked it back by saying, "I should have worn a Faraday cage," implying that he would jump again. He said he remembered about 90 to 95% on how to rebuild the machine. The rest would have to be done the Markham way, by trial and error. That interview was so sincere, so heartwarming that, once again, the listeners rallied around Mike.
But I just wanted to say that it's a great honor to talk to both Art and Madman Markham.
Thank you.
I've listened to the original broadcast back in the mid-'90s when I was a teenager, and I was fascinated by the story.
They pitched funding campaigns, book deals, even a collaboration with the government. But Mike wasn't too eager to accept outside funding again. He said that agencies like DARPA were trying to turn his machine into a weapon, and even if that wasn't the case, there were always strings attached to government funding. He emphasized that there was no such thing as a free lunch. It's not wrong. Mike also talked about the rumors on the internet. Stories had spread about a cat being on the couch when it vanished from his home, or about his machine blowing up, or about a photograph of him in the 1930s. Mike promised Art that this was all nonsense. He kept to himself for the last 15 years, and now people were just guessing about what happened. When you tell a story and pass it on, it changes a bit. Now, if you pass it on for 15 years, it starts to live a life of its own. Mike explained that time travel doesn't work like Hollywood movies. You can't just type in a date from the past and travel there. You can only go to a time where your time machine was actually built. So you can go backwards in time, but not to any point you choose. He gave an example. Let's say you want to witness the crucifixion. Unless you build a time machine in 33 AD and have it powered up, you can't return to that date. So if he built the machine today and had it powered up tomorrow, he could return to today. But he can't return to yesterday. So what that means, because he had a time machine in 1998, if he would build a machine today in 2015, he could go back to 1998 to when he first built the machine, if that makes sense. Science had reviewed Mike's work and said that his approach is not impossible. Einstein's equations do allow for time travel under certain conditions. Using electromagnetic fields to warp space-time, in theory, is possible. You just need an enormous amount of energy. Mike's machine, with its rotating magnetic fields and plasma vortex, isn't dramatically different from the theoretical spinning cylinder time machines that have been proposed. The biggest difference is scale. Mike pointed out that he was using electromagnetism, which is 10 to the 30th power stronger than gravity. So he didn't need a black hole to make his time machine work. Now, in layman's terms, as I understand it, he is saying that the number 10 multiplied by itself 30 times adds up to 1 nonillion. That's a 1 with 30 zeros. That's how much stronger an electromagnet is compared to gravity. So if a black hole is made of gravity, a magnet, according to Mike and science, is better. Of course, science also said he's not wrong, but there's not enough electricity on Earth to power that magnet. So, what are we to make of Mike's story? The fact that he has no evidence makes it impossible to verify. When Mike returned from his 2-year journey, everything that could prove any of it had disappeared. No machine, no documentation, no video footage, no witnesses. Just the testimony of a man whose memory had been damaged by the very experience he was trying to prove. Mike had real knowledge. He understood electrical engineering and electromagnetic theory well enough to have allegedly built this machine. He was able to explain it to an expert like Art Bell. Records of Mike's arrest are real. The newspaper coverage of him stealing the Transformers is also real. But the rest of the story we only know because Mike told us. So if his story was true, wouldn't any of the people who witnessed him jumping off that cherry picker have told a story by now, or did they all lose their memory too? Now that sounds like I'm a skeptic, but I'm not. These are just the facts. Here's the thing, if you listen to the whole interview, and now I'll link it below, Mike sounds very sincere. His knowledge and the way he explains it is very close to what science says is theoretically possible. And remember, in 1998, the internet was in its infancy. He could not have gotten his extensive knowledge on electronics and magnetism from Google or AI alone. And there's also the why. He didn't gain anything, no book deal, no money, no cushy job, mostly just agony. In other words, if this is a scam, you can't follow the money. You want to know where I stand? There's no logical explanation, but I'm inclined to believe him. It's crazy, I know, but it's my take on it. I've given you the facts as shown by my research without embellishment, so you can draw your own conclusion. But what we can say for sure is that Mike Markham's story captures something essential about the human spirit of discovery. There's a young man with no scientific training who looked further than science and said, what if? He wasn't going to say that time travel was impossible. He also wasn't looking to prove it. He was just trying to make a cool Jacob's ladder. In his interview with Art Bell, he said all he was trying to do was learn, and that's what he really wanted, to learn and continue his research, and I can relate to that. But there's more to the story. Mike Markham didn't just disappear into history. In February of 2022, Mike posted an update on a forum on Reddit. He confirmed that he was alive and well and living in Hawaii. In his post, he again talked about some of the urban legends that had grown around his persona. He wrote that rumors were circulating that he was dead. He had time traveled to the 1930s, where he died on a beach compressed in a metal tube. Next to the tube lay something that resembled a cell phone. The connection was made because the body in the tube had long red hair, and in his talk with Art Bell, Mike said if he would go through time again, he would take a cell phone. I searched for that post, but according to the internet, it never happened at all. All a hoax, as far as I could find. By September 2022, Mike had moved from Hawaii to Ohio. There he continues to follow his dream of building another time machine. Today, Mike Markham is in his 50s, though biologically he's 2 years younger.
From everybody else's point of view, for 2 years I didn't exist. If you basically do a Social Security search on me, for 2 years there won't be a peep.
He's kept a low profile, but he hasn't disappeared entirely. According to recent reports, Mike had spent most of his life working in tech, which I think makes sense. I am curious, though, is he still working on time travel? Maybe somewhere out there, in a workshop or a warehouse, Mike is still trying to rebuild his machine. Maybe he made it safer and found more efficient ways to generate the massive electromagnetic fields a machine needs. I hope so. The story of Mike Madman Markham raises the fundamental questions about the nature of time and the limits of science and the power of human curiosity. His story tells us that the universe is far stranger than any of us can fathom. In our everyday lives, we experience time as a river flowing in one direction. We're carried along from the past to the future, unable to swim upstream or leap ahead to see what's around the corner. But what if time isn't really like a river? What if it's more like an ocean, where by working your sails you could navigate in any direction you choose? Mike Markham believes he found a way to sail that ocean. The fact that he tried, that he built machines and conducted experiments, the fact that he did everything in pursuit of the impossible, that to me is a part of this story that's most fascinating, because in the end, not the destination, but the journey that defines us. And somewhere out there, maybe Mike Markham is still trying to bend time to his will. Maybe he succeeded, maybe he failed, or maybe he discovered that the real treasure isn't the ability to travel through time, but the courage to believe that time travel is possible in the first place. After all, in a universe where time and space can be warped by gravity, where particles can exist in multiple states at once, where the very act of observation changes reality. If that's proven, does time travel really sound that impossible? I think not, and that perhaps is the most important part of the story. The willingness to look at the impossible and say, at one point in time, we thought the sun revolved around the earth. I'll leave you to ponder on that one. I'm Henry, and this is What Now? Thanks for watching. When I did the story on John Titor last week, I thought it couldn't get any weirder. I was wrong. Just the research on this story alone made me question everything. Is it possible? I don't know. Maybe the best way to put it is, I want to believe.